The question of is he the president who lost Ukraine might weigh heavily on his position. So the argument that he came in, Ukraine's position collapsed soon afterwards, does he really want to be the one who wears that, would be one factor. If you have people like Mike Pompeo, um, prominent in the new administration, and some others who are big supporters of Ukraine, they might advocate for more support to Ukraine as part of a strong Republican overseas policy. And the desire to get an early result. Set against that, you have a lot more skepticism amongst the Republicans about the value of supporting Ukraine. There is, frankly, a little bit of sort of a slightly strange set of people who are enamored of Russia because they follow a kind of realist foreign policy. The vice president, of course, has been far more skeptical in setting out his position on the value of support to Ukraine. And then there is the thing that doesn't often go acknowledged, but is a common factor across US foreign policy, which is the need to focus on the Indo-Pacific and the rise of China. And you have a range of, if you like, Republican strategists, but also people who are in the national security sphere who have been raising the alarm on Chinese rearmament, who think that Europe's a distraction and frankly, Europe should step up.
And when you look, you said earlier about Trump wanting to be seen as the president who lost Ukraine. If you look at the legacy under the Biden administration and its escalation aversion, the slow decision making, the equivocation over weapons permissions and support, the lack of strategy, it was actually, you could argue, pushing Ukraine down the road towards defeat. This could be seen by Donald Trump as an opportunity.
Yes, I think there are plenty in the current administration who would quibble with that characterization in terms of the inevitable endpoint. But it is certainly the case that the current trajectory, the current speed at which support arrives, is negative for Ukraine. They are losing ground slowly. I think the caveat is a significant proportion of that relates to personnel issues. The number of people that the Ukrainians have recruited, mobilized, and trained. And that is input measurement that is not really in the gift of international backers. I mean, they can do some of the training outside the country, but if they can't mobilize enough people, they cannot overcome the Russian advantage in numbers at the moment. And that's regardless of material.
And Ukraine's defense minister, Rustem Umerov, says the North Korean troops appear to have been mixed in with the Russian army. The ISW assesses they will primarily be used by Russia to repel Ukrainian forces in Kursk. And I suppose the fear from Zelensky's position is that more will be coming. And he's also urging the foreign community to allow those long-range weapon strikes into Russia, saying he has pinpointed places where those North Korean troops are being based. Do you think there will be any movement on that? Or is he just using this as an opportunity to ask the same question again, but in a different way?
To a degree, I think he's making 2 points there. One is about the long-range strike weapons. It's worth noting that many of those Korean forces could be in range of the HIMARS rocket artillery already. And the Ukrainians have already got permission to use those, and they could quite happily use them to strike the North Koreans. So it feels like what he's doing there is trying to tack together the other issue about things like the TACMs, which would be useful, and Storm Shadow. I mean, I think I've said previously, Storm Shadow is best used against a particular set of targets. It's unlikely that there are many suitable targets amongst the North Koreans that you would use Storm Shadow against, but he's trying to kind of force that point home. I think the other thing that he's doing by emphasizing this is that even though it's a relatively small number of troops, it is a widening of the conflict on behalf of Russia using international partners. And I think there's a fair question to be asked, why is it that Russia can do this? Russia can take Iranian Shahed drones, fire them into Ukrainian cities, And yet there is continued concern over what happens if the mirror took place. And it's not even the mirror. I mean, nobody is talking about deploying a NATO brigade into Ukraine to fight Russian forces on the front line. And yet it appears that international partners are the ones who have been concerned about escalation. I mean, this is an escalation by international partners of Russia. There might be more to come. We don't really know. But I think by continuing to keep it in the public eye, Zelensky is pointing out what feels like an unequal relationship now in terms of international support, even in spite of the fact that there's billions still coming in. And I think I should have mentioned earlier, one other potential consequence of Trump being elected is that President Biden might choose to use all of the remaining authorization that he's got to accelerate and expand in the next 2 months military support.
At the moment, Russia seems to be willing to tolerate the cost of the war in terms of casualty as on the battlefield and also the financial cost of the country back home. Do you agree with the analysts who say Russia cannot sustain the war effort at this current level beyond 2025? And if so, how would you prepare for that moment and prevent a disingenuous ceasefire offering at that point?
So the first thing is that Russia's historically shown an incredibly high tolerance for pain and cost. The estimates of how much of their economy is now supporting the war effort or one form or another have skyrocketed. It's a significant percentage. People are talking over 30% now. The arrival of North Korean troops, I think, is a useful boon, but not vital, although they do want to reduce the pressure on their need for further mobilization. What we do see is that in material terms, that the weapons of war, equipment, all of those sorts of things, they have been overwhelmingly refurbishing equipment up until now. And the rough estimate from our researchers and others is that by the time we get deep into 2025, summer later in the year, they will be pretty close to expending all of their old supplies of tanks, of artillery barrels, of other things, armoured vehicles. And at some point then, they've got to start making new artillery barrels, which are complicated, and new armoured vehicles, and all of these other things. And that creates a potential vulnerability in two cases. First of all, they've got to keep up production at a pretty high rate to replace losses. Otherwise, their battlefield availability just drops. The second thing is it's another area where effective enforcement of sanctions could really hurt. We've just released a research project with some partners, which pointed out there are still elements of the artillery chain, the propellant, the materials that go into making barrels, that could be sanctioned, or rather, there are sanctions in place that they're not being effectively enforced, that could really cut the supply ending up on the front line. And when you combine that with Ukrainian deep strikes with their own drones, which are hitting ammunition storage, they could begin to hit a crunch. The problem is the current trend is such that there's a danger that Russia begins to make much more accelerated advances before they hit that crunch point.
Today, the UK has announced 56 new sanctions aimed at disrupting the supply of equipment for Putin's war machine. It's become the first country also to directly sanction the Russian-backed Africa Corps. It was timed to coincide with this meeting of the European political community set up in the wake of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine taking place in Hungary. President Zelensky is there. What else can he get from this, and how effective? I mean, these sanctions, these 56. Whenever I hear this, I kind of think, why didn't it happen before? What can you tell us about the timing of this, and what more President Zelensky can get from it?
So, the sanctions. I mean, the timing is obviously important in terms of showing continued political support from European partners for Ukraine. There's I'm occasionally a bit of a skeptic on what sanctions can achieve overall. They are not good at, on their own, forcing a country to back down. and that's because countries tend to develop evasion techniques and routes. But targeted sanctions can identify elements of a system, finance or material, that you can begin to pick apart and actually increase the pressure on a particular component. So I wouldn't say these sanctions will really bring an end to Russia's war, even though they still are targeting the war machine. But those that really pick at specific elements of the system, and I haven't looked through the latest list, can, if they're combined with enforcement activity, make a material impact. But a lot of this is fundamentally political signaling. I mean, I think the problem is that the mood music that's coming out of Kyiv at the moment is that thank you very much for the political signaling, but what I need is artillery, air defences, long-term financial support, and a change in permissions or a changed position on escalation rather than nice words.
And when you said earlier on, when we first started talking about the future and talking about what potential influence President Trump will have on this situation, you talked about the implications for Ukraine if the US withdraws its support and tries to force upon it this kind of these frozen lines, as it were. I mean, that is pretty unthinkable for President Zelensky, not least so because of the occupied territories and what would happen to the people, the Ukrainians who are there right now, who are suffering terribly. Can you just explain how it would actually play out exactly in theory? I mean, I know it's nothing that's actually been agreed at all, but what is the thinking on that?
Well, I mean, I think the problem is it's difficult to see how that would play out in both practical and political terms. I mean, politically, it's near unthinkable for the Ukrainians to accept that. So the Russians, at the moment, would either want to join up if you like, the four oblasts where they dominate. Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. That includes holding Crimea. That would be an enormous chunk of Ukraine gone. That would be essentially rewarding the Russians for the invasion. Even freezing the line where it is and having some kind of demilitarized zone would put things in a very unfavorable position for the Ukrainians. Let's say they evened up the territory in the north. So they gave back the territory in Kursk, and that was swapped for the Russian enlargement just north of Kyiv, maybe a couple of other places. That leaves them with a very awkward front line. They would argue it leaves them not well placed in the face of future Russian aggression. There would need to be some kind of security guarantee. And how would you enforce that? Would you be basing international forces in Ukraine as a tripwire? And fundamentally, it means saying goodbye to a massive chunk of the country and a population where the evidence that's come up so far, quite apart from fundamentally war crimes being committed by Russian troops, but the erasure of Ukrainian culture and society, changes in language use. There are obviously some parts of the country where Russian has been popular for a long time, but the Russians have extended that area. They have obviously had this kidnapping campaign to take children out into Russia proper, and they have been raising sites of significance to the Ukrainians. Like it would be wholly unacceptable. It would be difficult to see Zelensky or a future Ukrainian government agreeing to that. That could only come if there was the fear of future and imminent pressure that would take even more territory. I mean, it really would be a pretty dire situation for the Ukrainians if they were accepting any of those terms.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.